Dear friends, in this new lecture in the Apocalypse for Dummies cycle, we will begin to study the important question of the literary genre of the Apocalypse. Determining the literary genre of a book is crucial to its proper understanding. For example, you don't read laws, novels, poems, doctoral dissertations in history, etc., in the same way. Your expectations are not the same. In a novel, the author is free to imagine whatever he likes. Readers don't expect to read a story that reflects reality in an exact way. They just want to read an interesting, well-written story that will give them a good time and, in some cases, make them reflect about some aspect of human existence. On the other hand, in an academic dissertation in history, the author just cannot freely invent things. On the contrary, he or she must try to get as close as possible to the facts of what really happened. To take another example, there is no room for poetry in a legal text. Well, the Bible is the library, so to speak. It is made up of two main parts: the Old Testament with 46 books, at least for Catholics, because for other Christian denominations the number may be slightly different, and the New Testament with 27 books. These books were written at different times and, above all, belong to very different literary genres. And what is more, these books are at least 2,000 years old, and sometimes even more. While the literary genres of some of these books are easy to identify, others are much harder. The cultures and literary practices of the authors of biblical books are very different from our own. For example, if you read the Song of Songs, you will immediately realize that it is a poem. Here are a few verses from the Song of Songs, beginning of chapter 4. It is a description of the beloved. How beautiful you are, my love, how very beautiful. Your eyes are doves behind your veil. Your hair is like a flock of goats moving down the slopes of Gilead. Your teeth are like a flock of shorn ewes that have come up from the washing, all of which bear twins, and not one among them is bereft. Your lips are like a crimson thread, and your mouth is lovely. Your cheeks are like halves of a pomegranate behind your veil. Your neck is like the Tower of David, built in courses. On it hang 1,000 bucklers, all of them shields of warriors. Now, you may, of course, find a little bit odd to compare the teeth of a beautiful woman to a flock of sheep. But at least you understand that this is an Oriental poem. And in poetry, we like to use metaphorical images. Everyone understands that it would be wrong and it would be even stupid to take these images literally, because they belong to the literary genre of poetry, which uses metaphorical images. On the other hand, the literary genre of other books of the Bible may be much more difficult to clarify. For example, what is the literary genre of the first 11 chapters of Genesis? Is it history in the strict sense? Is it myth? That is not the same thing at all. Does the book of Jonah, which tells how the prophet is swallowed by the large fish, in whose belly he remains for 3 days and 3 nights, before emerging unscathed? So does the book of Jonah belong to the historical genre? Another example from the Bible. It is well known that Galileo was condemned in the 17th century by theologians who criticized him for saying that the earth revolved around the sun, something that those theologians considered to be contrary to the book of Joshua, which says that Joshua stopped the course of the sun across the sky. Well, these theologians made a mistake about the literary genre of the book of Joshua. The book of Joshua is not a treatise of astronomy. The Bible is not intended to substitute human science, but to teach us how to go to heaven. Moreover, when we say today that, for example, the sun rose this morning at 7 a.m., this obviously does not mean that we firmly believe that it is the sun that revolves around the earth and not the other way around. We are just talking in terms of appearances. In the first conference of this cycle, I highlighted the difficulty contemporary readers have in understanding the apocalypse. Actually, the main difficulty is this one. What is the literary genre of the apocalypse? The book of Revelation is par excellence the biblical book that you just can't understand unless you have some idea of what literary genre it belongs to. Well, this difficulty goes back a long way. In fact, it should be noted that understanding the literary genre of the apocalypse is quite recent in history. It is scarcely more than a century since biblical scholars have understood its literary genre, and this has enabled considerable progress to be made in research on the apocalypse. So let us ask the question, what is the literary genre of the apocalypse? Well, there is not just one, but 3. We could say that the apocalypse is a letter, that it is a prophecy, and that it is, well, an apocalypse. In other words, the book of Revelation falls within the epistolary literary genre. It is a letter. It falls within the prophetic literary genre. It is a prophecy. And it also belongs to the apocalyptic literary genre. It is an apocalypse. This means that the Apocalypse of John gave its name to a particular literary genre, which is apocalyptic literature, of which it is the most famous representative. We shall look at these 3 literary genres in turn. First, the epistolary genre. The Apocalypse of John is a letter. What does it mean? It means, like all letters of Greco-Roman antiquity, it begins by mentioning the name of the author, John is this in this case, the name of the addressees, and it also begins with a greeting. John to the 7 churches in Asia Minor. Grace to you and peace. It also ends with the final greeting. May the grace of the Lord Jesus be with you all. If the Apocalypse is a letter, we need to pay attention to the original recipients of this letter, that is, the 7 churches of Asia. And remember that Asia here is not the Asian continent, but the Roman province of Asia, located in present-day Turkey. And we know the original addresses: Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. Let us take a look at a map to see where these cities are located. Now, why was the book of Revelation addressed to these 7 churches rather than to others? Because actually there were other Christian churches in this area. In Colossae, for example, recipient of St. Paul's epistle to the Colossians. Well, actually, we don't know for sure. It is likely that John had a special link with these churches. Perhaps he had preached there himself. It has been noted that the 7 cities of Revelation are located on an ancient road, Roman road. And so we may think that John dictated the Apocalypse in Patmos, then copies were made immediately. One or more people took the boat from Patmos to the great harbor of the region, which was Ephesus. Ephesus, where a copy of the Apocalypse was left. From there, the messengers had to follow the Roman road, who took them successively to Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. At each stage of their journey, they left a copy of the book. The 7 churches of Asia quickly made copies of the book to send to other churches, which did the same for other churches, and so on. In this way, the Apocalypse quickly reached all the Christian communities. We can already see this phenomenon in St. Paul's letter to the Colossians. When this letter is read among you, writes Paul to the Colossians, make sure that it is also read in the church of Laodicea. And you also read the letter that will come to you from Laodicea. Colossians 4:16. Thus, the church of Colossae was explicitly invited to send a copy of the letter to the Colossians to the church of Laodicea, and to ask for a copy of the letter to the Laodiceans, which was perhaps the letter traditionally called the Epistle to the Ephesians. This is discussed by biblical scholars. It was probably in a similar way that all the Christian communities were able to become acquainted with the book in which they recognized a word from God for His church. Now I turn to the second literary genre. The Apocalypse is a prophecy. That's the second lettering genre to which the book of Revelation belongs. Now, the Apocalypse itself explicitly states that it is a prophecy. We read in chapter 1, verse 3, "Blessed is he who reads, and blessed are they who hear the words of this prophecy, and keep those things which are written in it, for the time is at hand." And at the end of the book, in 22:7, "Blessed is he who keeps the words of this book of prophecy." And again in 22:10, "Do not seal up the words of this book of prophecy." So the Apocalypse is presented as a prophecy. It is even the only book in the New Testament to present itself as a prophecy. Now, we need to understand what prophecy is in the biblical sense. I say in the biblical sense because in contemporary language, we generally call a prophet someone who foretells the future. And actually, many readers of the book of Revelation read it hoping to discover predictions of events to come. Some have gone so far as to claim that the Gulf War against Iraq in 1991 was foretold in chapter 9 of the book of Revelation because, this chapter mentions the river Euphrates, which flows through Iraq. Well, we shall look at chapter 9 when the time comes. But let us understand straight away that biblical prophecy is not primarily about predicting the future, but about enlightening the present with light coming from God. The prophet is a spokesman for God. Actually, this is the etymological meaning of the word prophetess in Greek. A prophet, assuming of course that he is a genuine prophet, because there are false prophets too. A prophet is somebody to whom God entrusts a message for his people. This message sheds light on the people's present situation and helps them to better understand what God expects of them. Now, of course, the message entrusted to the prophet may contain predictions about the future. But on the one hand, this is not always the case. And on the other hand, when it is the case, these predictions are only really understandable once the predicted event has taken place. For Christian readers of Revelation, I would add the following. Christ does not seek to satisfy people's curiosity. He reveals to them what is important for their salvation. John, therefore, was a prophet. The Lord entrusted him with a message initially intended for the 7 churches of Asia, even though the whole church would eventually benefit from it. This message sheds light on the historical situation of the churches to help Christians behave in the way God expects them to. The letters to the churches of Asia in chapters 2 and 3 of Revelation are a clear example of this. Now, if the Apocalypse is a prophecy, it is easier to understand the striking phenomenon that can be observed throughout the book. The Apocalypse, which never formally quotes the Old Testament is nevertheless saturated with allusions to the Old Testament, in particular to the prophetic books of Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, Zechariah, and so on. In the 408 verses of Revelation, there are more than 500 references to the Old Testament. Clearly, John sees himself as a continuation of the Old Testament prophets. He takes up and interprets the prophecies of the Old Testament in the light of Christ. He intends to show that Christ is the fulfillment of all the prophecies of the Old Testament. We can also see that the book of Revelation draws quite heavily on images coming from the Old Testament. Here is the table that does not claim to be exhaustive. Table of images coming from the Old Testament. The tree of life, the serpent, the rainbow, coming from Genesis, the plagues of Egypt, the lamb, the manna, the crystal sea, the desert, coming from Exodus, the four living beings, the New Jerusalem, coming from Isaiah, the four living beings, the prostitute, Gog and Magog, the measuring of the temple, the swallowing of a scroll, the tree of plagues, war, famine, pestilence, the protective seal. These are images coming from Ezekiel. The throne of God, the Son of Man, the white hair, the beast are images coming from Daniel. The locust, the harvest and the vintage, the sun darkened and the moon turned into blood are images coming from the book of Joel. The four horsemen, the candelabra in the temple are images coming from Zechariah. So the images have their source in the Old Testament. This is an important point to remember. We could say that Revelation is like a Christian rereading of Old Testament prophecies. But it is a rereading of Old Testament prophecies in the light of the decisive event in the history of salvation, which is the mystery of Christ, and especially the Paschal mystery, the death and resurrection of Jesus. In the next conference, we shall look at the third literary genre, which is the most mysterious one to us, the apocalyptic genre. See you soon for the next conference.